Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how you can query a visual, kind of like this dashboard, or any view really, doesn't need to be a dashboard, but how you could query a Tableau visual and get its content as a PDF file. So this will bring a few interesting things to the surface. First of all, just getting the PDF, what does that process look like? But then second of all, how do you really make this a real life kind of useful thing by being able to specify certain filter values? So something that we're going to be taking a look at is how we could set a filter value such as region to the West region, and then our order year to 2020. And we're also going to get into some kind of gotchas that could happen, such as, for example, here my field name has spaces in it, and we're going to see that the way that you can pass parameter values, like URL parameters that specify filters, this is done by modifying the URL that you're hitting. Like when you are making your request to the Tableau Server REST API, you can't just insert as a field name here something that has spaces in it or pipe characters. So we're going to take a look at how we could take something like this that has spaces and a pipe character in it, and how you can easily clean that so that your filter value is successfully communicated to the Tableau server. Otherwise, this will fail silently. Like if I pass this, Tableau is going to say, oh, I didn't find anything that matched this, and it's just not going to work. Either that or your endpoint's going to fail because you're trying to hit a URL that's just not compatible. All right, so let's see how this happens. How do we make this work? So let's hop into a Jupyter notebook. We are using Python to do this communication between our Tableau Online site, in my case, and this code that I'm writing. So I write everything in Python, and then Python library called tableau-api-lib is really what helps package up the information that I want to get out of the server and establish that communication point between me and the Tableau Online server. So for starters, we are importing a Tableau server connection. That's just a class that exists within the tableau-api-lib library that really is the root of how all this magic happens. Allows me to talk to the Tableau Online site or Tableau server. And we also are importing these useful functions that are part of this library. These are really just going to make our lives easier as we try to find some information, so we could query some information about our views and then process that a bit using this flattened dict column. And then finally, we're importing this parsing ability, which is really handy when you have a string of text and you want to make it URL friendly. So we'll make use of that. All right, this part, establishing a configuration for your connection, this is covered in another video that is linked in the description. So that video is called Getting Started with Tableau API-lib. I'm going to skip over that, and we'll just go right down here to where I establish the connection and I sign in. And now that I'm signed in, I'm going to go through a couple optional steps here. Rather than just diving in and assuming that you already know what your view ID is, chances are you have no idea what your view ID is, because this is something that you would only really access programmatically. So I'm just going to assume we don't know what the view ID is, and we can query all of the views that are accessible to our user account. I do want to drive that point home. This is accessible to the account that you authenticated with. So if you are an explorer, if that's your user role, you might not have access to all of the content on the server. So do be careful. If you want to see everything, you're going to need to have an account provisioned to you that is a Tableau server administrator, or you would need a Tableau administrator to grant you, read access or view access to pretty much every piece of content on the server. So do keep that in mind. The content that you are able to query is going to be limited by what your user role has permissions to see. So we can see now that we have all this view information, And something that we could do now at this point is maybe we have thousands of views, thousands of worksheets and dashboards in our Tableau environment. Let's go ahead and narrow this down to just a workbook that we care about. So for example, out here, I can see that this belongs to a particular workbook. The dashboard is part of a workbook, and all the other views that exist within this workbook we can see here in these tabs. So rather than look at all of the views that are available to me, I would like to flatten this column right here that was returned to me when I queried my views. And this is going to give me a bunch of information about the workbooks that these views belong to. And by unpacking this information, I'm going to be able to say, oh, here's a workbook that has a specific name. And that's actually the workbook that I care about. So let's go ahead and do that. We are using this flatten dict column function that we imported up at the top from the tableau-api-lib functions. And now we are just going to specify that we want to flatten this data frame that we created, had all of our view information. And the keys that we want to unpack are ID and name. So that is the ID and the name of the relevant workbook. And the column that we are unpacking is named workbook. You can just confirm that up here. So if we run this and we take a look at our resulting views data frame that's been modified, you'll notice that the workbook column is no longer over here, but over on the right hand side we can see that some information from that workbook column was unpacked for us. So now that we can see all these workbook names and interact with them in this nice pandas data frame, we could do something like this, where we say my relevant views data frame is going to be that same views data frame we were just looking at, but only where the workbook name equals some value which we knew ahead of time just by looking out here at my Tableau Online site. So I know that this query view as PDF workbook is the one that I'm wanting to play around with here, so that is the one that I'm filtering these views to. So now when we take a look at this, we can see all of the views that exist within that workbook, and if we really wanted to, we could cross-reference this against all of the tabs that we see out here, where each tab is a view that exists within that workbook, or a sheet. So that sheet is either an actual sheet or it's a dashboard tab. So now that we have filtered down the list of views, let's grab the one that we actually want to download a PDF for. In this case, that's going to be this dashboard multi-view. So I'll just grab its ID. We can see here the view ID. So I took this ID and I just pasted it down here. So we're setting this variable PDF view ID to be that ID of the view that we want. Let's go ahead and keep rolling. So I know that this video is about downloading a PDF, but downloading a PNG file is basically the exact same process. So just for laughs, let's go ahead and first download a really basic PNG image. The PDFs are a bit more customizable because you could change the orientation and the type. So like you could download it as a A4 PDF or an A3 with a portrait or a landscape orientation. So first, let's just grab the PNG image and we'll see how easy this is. I am using the Tableau API-lib's built-in query view image method, which corresponds directly to the Tableau REST API reference query view image endpoint. And what this is really doing for us is it's taking all of this information that we would need to stitch together from scratch, and the library is just taking care of that for us, and all we need to do is pass in the view ID. So we do that, and we can then save the content of whatever the server returns to us into whatever file name we want. So I'm going to name this downloaded view.png, and we're going to see that that happened really quickly, and we have this beautiful PNG file that looks just like our visual out on Tableau Online. Okay, so we've seen that process. Now let's just really quickly look at the endpoint that was generated for us in that. So this is what was actually basically the address that the library went and knocked on for Tableau to return us this content. and we can just, for your own reference here, we can look at these different URIs that are mentioned, all these different kind of GET requests that you could issue to get these images. And we can see that you have a base one, and this is actually the one that we just did. So our bit of text over here ends with /image, as we can see here. And if we wanted to, we could make a couple other URL parameters. So these URL parameters are what we're going to dive into next as we're downloading PDFs, so that we can specify things like filters. So for starters, let's just find query view PDF so we could reference this. Much like image, when we're downloading an image, we have this base URL, this base endpoint that we can modify with URL parameters. So let's take a look at what that looks like. First, let's just get a basic PDF file. Once again, we're using a built-in Tableau API-lib method here. Whereas before we used query view image, now we're doing query view PDF, and we pass in that same view ID. And this time we write the file to downloaded view basic PDF. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can take a look at that PDF, and this looks pretty much just like the PNG. Actually has maybe a little bit better definition. So moving right along, let's take a look at the endpoint. So just like before, we can see that there's no URL endpoint modifications here. It just stops with that /PDF. So let's make this a little bit interesting. Let's spice this up. Maybe you don't just want a PDF that comes out in the default settings. Maybe you would like to have some control over the orientation or the type. Now to show you, you don't have to guess these things. You could come out here to the documentation. This is the REST API reference, and you could find all of the different page types that you could specify. So for this example, I'm just going to run with A4. That's actually what I use out in the wild most often. So I'm going to stick with that. And I'm going to favor landscape over portrait as we move forward with this demonstration. But just so you can see what this looks like for both, let's run through this. So I am defining these parameters. The PDF params dictionary I'm making here is basically set up to where these keys are really just for your own keeping track of what parameters you're adding. These don't have anything to do with how the URL endpoint is going to be modified. This, however, is. It's very much relevant to how the URL endpoint is going to be modified. So let's see how this comes into play. I define this dictionary up here with the URL parameters I want to add to this request. And then down here, I'm going to use that same endpoint we just hit, query view PDF, with the same view ID, but this time I'm passing in this extra argument, parameter dict. And I set that equal to the PDF parameters that we just defined above. So if we write out the content that's returned to us, and then take a look at the endpoint, we can see here that we have modified the endpoint. It no longer ends with PDF, it ends with this question mark. Everything after the, this question mark and then some text. Everything after that question mark is an additional parameter that's modifying our request. In this case, it's giving us a PDF that's whose orientation is portrait and whose type is A4. So let's take a look at this. This is what we have. So portrait's going to give you this kind of long and skinny view, but let's run that again, this time for landscape. You can see down here in the modifying the URL endpoint that now orientation is set to landscape. We also just made that change up here in the PDF parameters that we set. So if we take a look at this, we can see now that we have this kind of wide and short view. So that's that difference between portrait and landscape. All right, so we now know how we can modify the look and feel of the PDF, but let's also touch on how we can pass a filter in so that we could filter our region. Instead of seeing all regions, we want to just see the West region. And for order date, we want to see 2020, a specific year. So let's make this happen. We're going to, first of all, define the field name for what we are filtering on. So in this case, I can see out here that my field name is order date year, and the other one is region. So if I define these, I'm going to go ahead and convert them on the fly. I'm going to use that URL lib library to parse this string value into something that's URL friendly. As we said before, the spaces and the pipe characters, etc., those aren't going to play nice with a URL. So we do need to convert them into something that will play nice with the URL. It's exactly what happens here. All of our spaces get converted into %20, and our pipe character gets converted into %7c. So in the browser, when you're looking at a URL, those conversions are going to play nicely with the URLs, and it knows how to interpret them. All right, so let's do the same for our year. The year didn't have anything in there that was nasty, so it doesn't need any conversion. So now let's just run this. We are going to add another parameter to our PDF params. This is the filter for our year. And I'm using an F string here. What the F string does is it allows us to, within these quotes, we can insert some variables that we have. So up here, we define the Tableau year field name. We just insert that, and then we have that, we say that the year field name should equal whatever the value we wanted to filter to was. So let's run this and take a look at the file that's generated as well as the endpoint. So you can see here, just like before, we had orientation equals landscape, type equals A4. Now we get this VF underscore whatever our field name is equals whatever we wanted to filter to. And now we can add as many of these filters as we want, as we'll see in the next little demonstration. But first, let's take a look at how this played out for us. We can see our region is still set to all, but our order date is now filtered to 2020. So compare that to what we saw just a second ago. Maybe I have to close these first. All right. Yep, just had to reopen that. So we could see before we had a new column for every year, but in the view that we just generated, we get that one single year, 2020. All right, so now the final demonstration. Let's also filter on region. So we'll go through that same song and dance where we make sure that we make this URL friendly. And region is the field that we're filtering on. West is the value that we're filtering to. And we have the same PDF params we had before, except this time we're also adding in a filter, a view filter for our region. And I'll also point out that you do always have to have the VF underscore if you're making a view filter. That's not something that I came up with. This is just something, the way that the Tableau Server REST API works. All right, so let's run all of this together and see that final output. So you can see that we have our same filter that was there before. VF order date year equals 2020, and then we get that and sign, and we get VF region equals West. So let's take a look at this final output, and we can see, sure enough, we're getting now just the West region and the year 2020. That's it. This is how you can download a view that exists out in your Tableau server or Tableau Online environment, and you can customize how that PDF lands in your local environment. So hopefully this has helped you, and you could expand on this and you could build your own scripts that even cycle through all possible filter values and download PDFs and then maybe archive them or email them to other people. Those are some common use cases out in the wild. So if anyone has been struggling with that, hopefully this video helps you. So see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.